The autumn wind carried the scent of sage and dust across the Nebraska frontier, rattling the loose boards of Sarah Mackenzie's cabin like skeletal fingers. She stood at the window, watching the sun bleed red across the horizon, painting the grasslands in shades of copper and rust. It had been 3 months since they'd lowered Thomas into the hard earth behind the chapel in town. 3 months since she'd become another widow in a land that collected them like tumbleweeds. At 24, Sarah was too young to wear black forever. The townswomen said, too pretty to waste away in that cabin at the edge of nowhere. But they didn't understand. The cabin wasn't a prison. It was all she had left of Thomas, of the dreams they'd carried west in their wagon, of the life they'd planned to build with their own hands. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, watching her breath fog the window. The vastness of the prairie stretched endlessly before her, broken only by the dark line of cottonwoods along Willow Creek. Sometimes she felt like the last person alive in the world, especially when the coyotes began their evening chorus and the shadows grew long and strange. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Sarah sipped it anyway, grimacing at the bitter taste. She'd stopped bothering with proper meals weeks ago. What was the point of cooking for one? The cornbread went stale, the beans grew cold, and the silence at the table pressed against her ears until she wanted to scream. A movement in the grass caught her eye. Sarah leaned closer to the window, squinting into the dying light. Nothing, just the wind bending the prairie grass, creating waves like a golden ocean. But lately, she'd felt eyes on her. It was foolish, she knew, the kind of fancy that came from too much solitude. Still, sometimes, when she collected water from the well or fed the chickens, the hair on her neck would rise, and she'd spin around to find only empty land staring back. The nearest neighbor, old Walter Hutchins, lived 2 miles east. The town of Clearwater sat 5 miles west, close enough to reach in an emergency, far enough to feel like another world. Thomas had chosen this spot deliberately, away from the judgment and restrictions of town life. "We'll build our own paradise," he'd promised, his eyes bright with fever dreams that turned out to be actual fever. Sarah moved away from the window and lit the oil lamp, chasing shadows into the corners of the single room. The cabin was small but sturdy. Thomas had been particular about that. Good timber walls, a proper stone fireplace, a real glass window that had cost them dear. The bed stood against the far wall, still made for 2, though only one side showed the wrinkles of sleep. His rifle hung above the door, loaded and ready, just as he'd taught her. She'd thought about moving back to town, taking a room at Mrs. Garrett's boarding house, maybe finding work at the general store. But something held her here. Pride, perhaps, or stubbornness, or the simple fact that leaving would mean admitting Thomas was really gone, that their dream had died with him in that bed while she held his burning hand and whispered lies about tomorrow. The fire needed tending. Sarah knelt before the hearth, adding a log to the dying flames. The wood was getting low, another chore she'd need to handle alone. Thomas had always split the wood while she gathered kindling. Now she did both, her hands growing rough and capable in ways her mother back in Ohio would have mourned. As she poked at the fire, Sarah heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the prairie night, not the yip of coyotes or the rustle of wind through grass. This was deliberate, measured. Footsteps. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she reached for the rifle. Thomas had taught her to shoot, made her practice until she could hit a tin can at 50 yards. But her hands shook now as she lifted the heavy weapon, checking that it was loaded, cocked, ready. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow and purposeful, too heavy for a coyote, too confident for a vagrant. Sarah pressed her back against the wall beside the window, rifle raised, trying to peer out without showing herself. Nothing, just darkness and wind, but the footsteps continued, and now she could hear breathing, deep, steady breathing that seemed to come from a chest far larger than any normal man's. The boards of the porch creaked under immense weight. "Who's there?" Sarah called, proud that her voice came out steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "I'm armed, and I know how to use it." The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. Sarah counted her heartbeats. 10, 20, 30. Then, just as she began to think she'd imagined it all, a shadow passed by the window. Massive, impossibly tall. She glimpsed it for only a moment, a silhouette that blocked out the stars, broader than any man she'd ever seen. Then it was gone, melting back into the prairie darkness as if it had never been. Sarah stayed pressed against the wall until her legs cramped and her arms ached from holding the rifle. Only when the first pale light of dawn crept across the floor did she finally lower the weapon and sink into Thomas's chair by the fire. That's when she heard the talk in town, whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the general store, worried glances between the women at the well. There were stories of a giant Apache warrior seen in these parts, a man who stood 7 feet tall and moved like a shadow despite his size. Some said he was a ghost. Others claimed he was real as rain, a warrior separated from his people, haunting the borderlands between the white settlements and the tribal territories. Folks say he's been watching the homesteads. Mrs. Garrett had murmured to her sister, not knowing Sarah could hear. Looking for something, or someone. Sarah had gathered her supplies quickly that day, ignoring the sympathetic looks that followed her. Let them think she was another hysterical widow, jumping at shadows. But she knew what she'd seen, what she'd felt. That night, she moved Thomas's chair to face the door and sat with the rifle across her lap, fighting sleep. The giant didn't return, but she felt his presence like a weight in the air, watching, waiting. For what? She couldn't say. But as the lonely days stretched into lonelier nights, as the prairie wind whispered secrets she couldn't understand, Sarah began to realize that her solitude had taken a different shape. She was alone, yes, but she was no longer unobserved. The giant Apache was out there, somewhere in the vast darkness, and for reasons she couldn't fathom, he had chosen to watch over her, or watch her. The distinction mattered less with each passing day. What mattered was the strange comfort she found in knowing those inhuman footsteps would return, that someone, something, found her worth watching in this empty land. It was a dangerous thought for a widow to have, but danger, Sarah was learning, was better than the suffocating weight of being forgotten, of disappearing into the prairie grass like she'd never existed at all. The coffee grew cold again in her cup. The fire burned low, and somewhere out there in the darkness, she knew, the giant walked his mysterious path, drawn to her cabin by forces neither of them yet understood. The storm came without warning on a November night, rolling across the prairie like the wrath of God himself. Sarah had seen bad weather before. Thomas had held her through plenty of thunderstorms. But this was different. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed, slamming into the cabin walls with enough force to make the timbers groan. She'd secured the shutters and brought the chickens into the small lean-to attached to the cabin, but still the storm raged harder. Lightning split the sky in jagged white tears, illuminating the grassland in stark, terrifying flashes. In those brief moments of brilliance, the familiar landscape transformed into something alien, a writhing sea of grass and shadow. Sarah huddled near the fireplace, feeding it steadily to keep the cold at bay. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in an hour, and now sleet mixed with rain hammered against the roof like gunshot. She pulled Thomas's old coat around her shoulders, breathing in the fading scent of tobacco and hard work that still clung to the wool. Thunder crashed overhead, so loud she felt it in her chest. The oil lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Sarah had just risen to check the door bolt when lightning blazed again, and in that instant of white fire, she saw him. He stood perhaps 20 feet from her window, motionless despite the gale that bent the grass flat around him. The giant. Even through the rain-streaked glass, even in that split second of illumination, his size defied belief. He towered above the storm like some ancient god, rain streaming down a face carved from dark stone. Sarah's scream died in her throat as darkness reclaimed the world. She pressed against the window, waiting for the next flash, her breath fogging the cold glass. When it came, the space where he'd stood was empty, Only the thrashing grass remained, but she knew he was still there. She could feel him the way animals sense predators, a primitive awareness that raised every hair on her body. The storm suddenly seemed less threatening than whatever waited outside her door. Another lightning strike, closer this time. The thunder followed instantly, shaking dust from the rafters. And there, movement by the well, a shadow too large, too solid to be windborne. He was circling the cabin, she realized, checking her defenses, or simply watching, as he'd done for weeks now. Sarah grabbed the rifle, though her hands shook so badly she doubted she could hit the broadside of a barn. What good would bullets do against something that stood untouched in a storm that bent trees double? The wind suddenly died, not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had slammed a door on it. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the howling had been. Rain still fell, but gently now, pattering against the roof like nervous fingers. Then came the knock. 3 measured raps on her door, loud enough to echo through the cabin. Sarah's knees nearly buckled. In all his weeks of watching, he'd never approached the door, never made his presence so deliberately known. She stood frozen, rifle clutched to her chest, as the knocks came again, patient, unhurried, as if he knew she had nowhere to run. "What do you want?" The words came out as a whisper. She cleared her throat. Tried again. "I said, what do you want?" No answer, just the soft patter of rain and her own ragged breathing. Sarah crept to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. Nothing. But she could feel him there, waiting on the other side of those 2 inches of oak. The presence was overwhelming, like standing next to a mountain. Lightning flashed again, and she glimpsed his shadow through the gap beneath the door. Bare feet, impossibly large, planted firm on her porch boards. He wasn't even seeking shelter from the rain. "Please," she said, hating how small her voice sounded. "Just go away." A sound came then, not quite a laugh, but something like it, deep as thunder, brief as breath. Then those massive feet turned and moved away, each step making the porch boards cry out in protest. Sarah stayed pressed against the door until her legs cramped. Only when she was certain he'd gone did she dare peek through the window. The storm was already moving on, grumbling its way east across the prairie. Stars began to appear through the breaking clouds. That's when she saw what he'd left. On her porch, placed precisely where she couldn't miss it, sat a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Sarah stared at it for a long moment, then grabbed a poker from the fireplace and used it to drag the bundle inside, slamming the door behind it. Inside the waterproof wrapping lay fresh venison, already cleaned and cut, enough meat to last her 2 weeks if she was careful. Beneath it, wrapped separately, were herbs she didn't recognize, dried leaves and roots that smelled of earth and rain. Sarah sank into her chair, staring at the offering. The meat was expertly butchered, the cuts precise. This wasn't the work of some savage. As the town folks claimed, this was skilled, careful, deliberate. But why? What did he want from her? She stored the meat in her cold cellar, hanging it properly to keep. The herbs she left on the table, unsure what to do with them. That night, sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of giants walking through storms, untouched by lightning, unmoved by wind. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Sarah ventured out to check for storm damage, rifle in hand as always. The chicken coop had held, though the birds seemed nervous. Clustered in the far corner, a few shingles had blown off the cabin roof, another repair to add to her endless list. That's when she found the footprints. They circled her cabin completely, pressed deep into the rain-softened earth. Each print was nearly twice the length of her own foot, the stride so long she had to take 3 steps to match one of his. But it was the pattern that made her breath catch. He hadn't just circled randomly. The tracks showed where he'd stopped to brace her loose shutters, where he'd shifted a water barrel to block the wind from her chicken coop door. He'd spent the storm not sheltering but protecting her cabin, her animals, her. Sarah followed the tracks to where they led away. toward the creek and the cottonwoods beyond. She stood there a long moment, wind tugging at her skirts, trying to understand this strange guardian who watched from the shadows and left meat on her porch. That evening, she cooked some of the venison, seasoning it with salt and the last of her pepper. It was tender, flavorful, better than anything she'd managed to hunt herself. As she ate, she found herself glancing at the window, wondering if he watched her now, wondering if he knew she was eating his gift. The herb still sat on her table, mysterious and somehow patient. On impulse, Sarah took a pinch of the dried leaves and added them to her coffee. The taste was strange, but not unpleasant, earthy and slightly sweet, with a warmth that spread through her chest and eased the constant knot of tension she carried. She slept better that night than she had in months. No dreams, no starting awake at every sound, just deep, restful sleep that left her feeling stronger come morning. The storm had changed something, not just in the weather, which turned cold and crisp with the promise of winter, but in the very air around her cabin. She still felt watched, but the sensation had shifted from menacing to something else, protective, perhaps, or possessive. Sarah tried not to think too hard about which it might be, or about the way her heart now jumped not entirely from fear when she sensed him near. The giant Apache had shown he could reach her whenever he chose. He'd stood at her door in the storm, knocked politely as any neighbor might, and like any neighbor, he'd brought gifts. But neighbors didn't watch from the shadows. Neighbors didn't move like smoke through the darkness. Neighbors didn't stand untouched in lightning storms, tall as myths and twice as impossible. Whatever he was, whatever he wanted. Sarah knew the storm had been only the beginning. Winter was coming to the prairie, and with it, answers to questions she wasn't sure she was ready to ask. But ready or not, she sensed her time of simply being watched was ending. The giant had made his presence known. Now it remained to be seen what he intended to do about it, and what she intended to do about him. The morning Sarah found the footprints beside her well. She knew he'd been closer than ever before, fresh in the frost-hardened earth. Each print was clear as a signature, massive. Bare feet that had stood there while she slept, perhaps watching her window, perhaps ensuring she had water for another day. She was examining the tracks, tracing their impossible size with her eyes, when his voice came from behind her. "You are too thin." Sarah whirled, her bucket clattering to the ground. He stood at the edge of her property where the grassland began, and even at 30 feet away, his size stole her breath. The stories hadn't exaggerated. If anything, they'd failed to capture the sheer presence of him. 7 feet of muscle and sinew, shoulders broad as a barn door, skin the color of burnished copper in the morning sun. He wore deerskin leggings and a cloth shirt that strained across his chest. His hair, black as crow feathers, fell past his shoulders, held back by a leather band. But it was his face that held her, angular and strong, with eyes dark as deep water, watching her with an intensity that made her knees weak. "You've been leaving me food," Sarah said, surprised her voice worked at all. He inclined his head slightly. "The widow Mackenzie needs meat for winter." The way he said her name, correctly, carefully, told her he'd been listening in town, learning about her. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt an odd flutter in her stomach. "I can hunt for myself." His eyes moved over her, taking in her thin frame, the hollows in her cheeks. "No, you cannot." The simple truth of it stung. Sarah lifted her chin. "I've managed so far. Eating sparrows and rabbits, growing weak." He took a step closer, and Sarah had to fight not to retreat. "A hard winter comes. You will not survive it alone." "That's none of your concern." Something shifted in his dark eyes. Amusement, perhaps. "I have made it my concern." "Why?" The question burst out before she could stop it. "Why watch me? Why help me? What do you want?" He was quiet for so long, Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words hit her like physical blows. "By winter, you'll have my son growing inside you." The bucket rolled away in the wind, clanking against stones. Sarah stared at him, unable to process what she'd heard. "What did you say?" You heard. His voice was calm, certain, as if stating a simple fact like the coming of snow. I have chosen you. You will bear my child. You're insane. Sarah backed away, hand reaching for the rifle she'd stupidly left inside. You can't just... I can... He moved then, faster than something his size should move, closing half the distance between them in 2 strides. But I will not take by force. You will choose me. Never. The word came out as a whisper. He smiled then, a slight curve of lips that transformed his stern features. You already look for me in the shadows, already listen for my steps. Your body knows what your mind denies. Heat flooded Sarah's cheeks. Get off my land. This was my people's land before your husband put stakes in it. His voice held no anger, just fact. But I do not come to reclaim Earth. I come to claim you. I'm not property to be claimed. I'm not... Sarah's voice broke. My husband hasn't been gone 4 months. Your husband is dead. The blunt words should have been cruel, but his tone was almost gentle. You mourn him in an empty bed while your body cries out for life. I can smell your loneliness like smoke. Stop. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself. Just stop. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. I am Ayan, of the Chiricahua. My name means bright. You should know the name of your child's father. We're not... Sarah couldn't even finish the sentence. Not today, Ayan agreed. Not tomorrow, but soon. Sarah Mackenzie, you will open your door to me. And when you do, I will plant my seed in your belly as surely as your husband planted corn in this earth. The crude certainty of it should have sent her running. Instead, Sarah found herself frozen, caught by something in his eyes. Not arrogance or lust, but a deeper knowing, as if he could see through her widow's weeds to the aching emptiness beneath. The town will run you off if you keep coming here, she managed. They're already talking about the Apache giant. They'll send riders. Let them come. Ayan's smile widened, showing white teeth. I have walked between their bullets before. Their fear makes them stupid. I'll shoot you myself if you come near my cabin again. No, he said simply. You will not. The certainty in his voice made her angry. You don't know me. I know you wake crying in the night. I know you hold your husband's pillow to your chest and breathe in his fading scent. I know you stand at your window and search the darkness, hoping for something, anything, to break the silence of your grief. Sarah's eyes burned with sudden tears. How dare you? I know, Ayan continued, his voice dropping lower. Because I too have lost my woman, my child, to the white man's sickness. I know the shape of emptiness, the weight of a bed meant for 2. The tears spilled over then, hot on her cold cheeks. Sarah turned away, unable to bear the understanding in his eyes. Please, just leave me alone. I will give you time, he said, but not much. Winter comes quickly here. She heard him move away, his footsteps nearly silent despite his size. When she finally turned back, he was at the edge of the grass again, pausing to look back at her. The herbs I left, brew them in hot water when your monthly blood comes. They will ease the pain and prepare your womb. Sarah's face burned. I won't. You will, he said with that maddening certainty. Your body is young and strong. It wants to create life, even as your heart clings to death. I will help you remember what it means to be alive. Then he was gone, melting into the landscape like morning mist despite his enormous frame. Sarah stood by the well, shaking not entirely from cold, until the sun climbed high enough to warm her face. That night, she barred the door and checked the rifle twice, but when she finally fell asleep, her dreams weren't of Thomas. They were of dark eyes and copper skin, of massive hands that could snap her like kindling but touched with surprising gentleness. She woke with her body aching in ways it hadn't since Thomas fell ill, alive with wants she'd thought buried with him. The herbs sat on her table, innocuous in their cloth wrapping. Sarah told herself she'd burn them, throw them out, ignore their existence. But when her monthly time came 3 days later, bringing its familiar cramps and misery, she found herself brewing them into tea with shaking hands. The warmth that spread through her belly was more than physical. It was as if the herbs carried some essence of their giver, wild and strong and absolutely certain of what was to come. Sarah Mackenzie, widow, Christian woman, respectable citizen of Clearwater, sat in her lonely cabin and drank tea brewed from Apache herbs. And in the darkness beyond her window, she knew. Ayan waited with the patience of the earth itself. His promise echoed in her mind. By winter, you'll have my son growing inside you. Impossible, unthinkable. The very idea should repulse her. So why? She wondered as she sipped the strange, earthy tea. Did her treacherous body warm at the thought? Why did her empty womb ache with something other than grief? Winter was coming, and with it, Sarah feared. A reckoning she was nowhere near ready to face. The deer carcass appeared at dawn, hung properly from the oak post near her cabin, already dressed and ready for butchering. Sarah stood in her doorway, shawl pulled tight against the morning chill, staring at the offering. 3 weeks had passed since Ayan's bold declaration. 3 weeks of finding gifts despite her protests. Meat, firewood, even a pair of rabbit-skin mittens left on her porch. She should have been frightened, should have ridden to town and demanded the sheriff form a posse. Instead, she found herself looking for him in the purple shadows of dusk, listening for footsteps that rarely came. He was there, she could feel him, but he kept his distance, true to his word about giving her time. Sarah approached the deer, running her hand over the clean cuts. Thomas had been a decent hunter, but this was artistry. Not a scrap of meat wasted, the hide removed so skillfully it could be tanned whole. Despite herself, she felt a flutter of appreciation for the care taken. "I know you're watching," she called to the empty morning. "This has to stop." No answer came, but she hadn't expected one. Ayan revealed himself on his own terms, appearing and vanishing like weather. Sarah set about cutting the meat into portions, her movements sharp with frustration. She couldn't keep accepting his gifts. Each one felt like a thread binding her to his impossible promise. That afternoon, she rode to town for supplies, needing the normalcy of human voices and ordinary concerns. But even Clearwater felt different now, smaller somehow, its routines pale against the vivid presence that haunted her homestead. "Sarah, dear, you're looking well." Mrs. Patterson observed at the general store, her eyes sharp with curiosity. "Better than you have in months." It was true. The herbs Ayan left, which she'd sworn not to use but somehow kept brewing, had eased more than her monthly pains. Her sleep came deeper, her appetite stronger. The hollow look was leaving her cheeks, replaced by something her mirror called health but felt dangerously like vitality. "The fresh air agrees with me," Sarah said carefully, selecting flour and coffee. Mrs. Patterson leaned closer, voice dropping. "You haven't seen that Indian about, have you? The giant? Bill Morrison swears he spotted him near Widow Craig's place last week." "No," Sarah lied smoothly. "I've seen nothing unusual," but her hands trembled as she paid, and she felt Mrs. Patterson's eyes following her to the door. The whole ride home, Sarah's mind churned. How long before someone connected Ayan's presence to her improving health? How long before suspicion turned to something worse? She was unsaddling her mare when she sensed him. The horse nickered softly, ears pricked but unafraid. And Sarah turned to find Ayan standing at the edge of her property, in daylight. He was even more imposing, the afternoon sun catching copper highlights in his skin, his hair gleaming like polished obsidian. "You went to town," he said, not a question. "I needed supplies." Sarah busied herself with the saddle, trying to ignore how her pulse quickened. "Supplies I paid for with money? Like civilized people do." Civilized. He seemed to taste the word. "Is that what you call it when they whisper about you, when they pity the barren widow?" The word stung like a slap. "How dare you? They smell death on you," Ayan continued, moving closer with that unnerving grace. "I bring you life, and you cling to their approval." "Their approval keeps me safe. If they knew about you, they would do nothing." He stood close enough now that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "They fear me, As they should. I don't fear you, Sarah said, surprising herself with the truth of it. His hand rose, hovering near her cheek without touching. No, you do not. That is why I chose you. The air between them crackled with tension. Sarah found herself swaying toward him, drawn by something deeper than reason. His scent enveloped her, leather and sage and wild places untouched by civilization. Tell me about her, she heard herself say. Your woman. Ayan's hand dropped. For a moment, his controlled expression cracked, revealing depths of old pain. Her name was Aiyana. Like the dawn, she died bringing our son into the world, and he followed her before the sun set. I'm sorry. The words felt inadequate. The white doctor came too late, said our medicine was savage, our ways primitive. But his civilized medicine could not save them either. Ayan's jaw tightened. I burned their bodies as is proper and walked away from my people. Could not bear their pity, their whispers. Understanding bloomed in Sarah's chest. That's why you're here, alone. Not alone. His dark eyes found hers again. Not anymore. Ayan, you grieve a man who gave you no children, who left you with nothing but land you cannot work and dreams you cannot fulfill. His voice gentled. I offer you strong sons, protection, a purpose beyond waiting for death. And what do you get? Sarah asked, though she thought she knew. A woman who understands loss but hasn't let it break her. A womb to carry my bloodline. A chance to build what was stolen from me. The naked honesty of it took her breath away. No pretty words about love or romance, just raw need meeting raw need. It should have repelled her. Instead, she found herself considering his offer with dangerous clarity. The town would never accept it. A white woman with an Apache. We would go west, Ayan interrupted. To the territories where such things matter less. I know places where we could live freely. Leave? Sarah looked around at the cabin Thomas built, the land he'd claimed. I can't just leave. You can't stay. Ayan gestured at the homestead. Another winter alone will break you, if not your body, then your spirit. I have watched you. Sarah Mackenzie, you are strong, but strength has limits. She wanted to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. He was right. Each day grew harder, lonelier, the weight of solitude pressing down like stones. The townsfolk's pity was almost worse than isolation, their careful kindness, a constant reminder of what she'd lost, what she'd never have. I don't love you, she said quietly. Love comes after. Ayan replied. First comes choice, then trust, then bodies learning each other. Love grows from such soil. And if I can't give you sons, if I'm barren like they whisper. His hand rose again, this time settling warm and heavy on her flat stomach. Even through layers of cloth, his touch burned. You are not barren. I would smell it if you were. Your womb waits, empty and eager. It will quicken at my seed. The crude confidence should have offended her. Instead, heat poulomed low in her belly, her body responding to his certainty with treacherous enthusiasm. Sarah stepped back, breaking the contact. I need time to think. Think quickly. Ayan glanced at the sky where clouds gathered like promises. Snow comes soon, and with it, decision time. He left her standing there, one hand pressed to her stomach where his touch still lingered. That night, Sarah lay wakeful, arguing with herself until dawn painted the windows gray. Every practical reason demanded she refuse him. Every lonely hour insisted she consider it. When she finally slept, she dreamed of copper-skinned children with her green eyes, playing in territories she'd never seen while their giant father taught them to walk between two worlds. She woke with tears on her cheeks and an ache in her chest that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with want. The dance had begun in earnest now, resistance and temptation spinning round each other like partners at a barn raising, and with each gift left at her door, each glimpse of him at the edge of her land. Sarah felt her resistance weakening. Winter was coming, and with it, a choice that would change everything. The wolves came on the first night of December, when the moon hung like a silver coin in the frozen sky. Sarah woke to their howling. Not the distant songs she'd grown accustomed to, but close, circling, hungry. The chickens erupted in panic, their terrified squawks piercing the night. She grabbed Thomas's rifle and crept to the window. In the moonlight, she counted 6 shadows slinking around her property, their eyes gleaming like yellow lanterns. They were thin, desperate. The early winter had been harder than expected, game scarce, and her chickens, her precious laying hens, were easy prey locked in their coop. Sarah's hands shook as she checked the rifle. 1 shot, maybe 2 before they'd scatter or, worse, turn on her. The wolves grew bolder, one testing the chicken wire with its teeth. She had to do something, but stepping outside meant exposing herself to the pack. A thud on the roof made her jump, then another, like footsteps overhead. The wolves heard it too, their heads swiveling upward, ears flat against their skulls. A shadow dropped from her roof, massive, fluid, landing in a crouch that made no sound despite its size. "Ayan." He rose slowly, moonlight painting his bare chest silver, a war club in one hand and a knife in the other. The wolves backed away, confused by this new threat. The largest, probably the alpha, bared its teeth and growled low in its throat. Ayan growled back, a sound that raised every hair on Sarah's body, not human, not animal, but something between that spoke of ancient nights when men were prey and learned to become predators. He spread his arms wide, making himself even larger, and took a step toward the pack. The alpha lunged. What followed was brutal in its efficiency. Ayan sidestepped the attack, bringing his club down on the wolf's skull with a crack that echoed across the prairie. He spun, knife flashing, catching another wolf that tried to flank him. The blade opened its throat in a spray of dark blood against snow. The remaining wolves circled warily, but their courage was breaking. Ayan stood over their fallen packmates, chest heaving. Blood spattered across his skin like war paint. He raised his head and howled, a sound that started human and ended wild, claiming territory, warning off challengers. The pack fled, melting back into the darkness like smoke. Only their dead remained, steaming in the cold air. Sarah realized she'd pressed herself against the window, barely breathing throughout the fight. Now she rushed to the door, hands fumbling with the bar. "Ayan!" He turned at her voice, and she saw the knife slash across his ribs, blood running dark down his side. Without thinking, she threw open the door. "You're hurt." "It is nothing." But he swayed slightly, the adrenaline of battle fading. "Get inside." When he hesitated, she grabbed his arm, like grabbing warm stone. "Now, before you bleed to death on my porch." He allowed her to guide him in, ducking through her doorway, his presence immediately filling the small cabin. Sarah's hands shook as she lit more lamps, finally getting a clear look at the wound. The slash ran from his lower ribs to his hip, not deep, but bleeding freely. "Sit," she commanded, pushing him toward Thomas's chair. The fact that he obeyed told her he was hurting more than he admitted. Sarah gathered clean cloth and water, trying not to think about how she was about to touch him, really touch him, for the first time. She knelt beside the chair, acutely aware of his steady gaze as she cleaned the wound. His skin was furnace hot under her fingers, marked with old scars that told stories of other battles. Sarah tried to keep her touch clinical, but her hands lingered, learning the terrain of muscle and bone. "Why?" she asked quietly, dabbing away blood. "Why risk yourself for my chickens?" "Not for chickens," his voice rumbled through his chest. "For you." I had the rifle. 1 shot, maybe wound 1 wolf before they reached you." His hand covered hers, stilling her ministrations. "You would have died protecting birds." "They're all I have left," Sarah said, then heard how that sounded. "I mean, I know what you mean." He released her hand. "But you are wrong. You have more than chickens now." The weight of his words settled over her as she finished cleaning the wound. It needed stitching, but the bleeding was slowing. She wrapped clean bandages around his middle, trying to ignore how intimate it felt, how her body responded to his nearness. "There," she said, sitting back on her heels. "You'll live." "Yes." He caught her wrist as she started to rise. "Sarah." The way he said her name, soft, careful, like tasting something precious, made her throat tight. She looked up at him, this giant who'd fought wolves for her, who sat bleeding in Thomas's chair like he belonged there. "Thank you," she whispered. His thumb stroked the inside of her wrist, finding her pulse. "You opened your door to me. You were hurt. You opened your door." His dark eyes held hers. "As I said you would." The truth of it hit her like cold water. She had, without hesitation, she'd invited him in, tended his wounds, let him fill her home with his presence. The barrier she'd maintained for months had fallen in an instant. "This doesn't mean," she started. "It means what it means." He released her wrist and stood, testing his bandages. Even wounded, he moved with that fluid grace. "The wolves will not return, but other dangers will come. You need protection. I've managed, by luck, by my watching, but I cannot always be your shadow." He moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "Think on this. Sarah Mackenzie. Think what might have happened tonight if I had not come." Then he was gone, leaving only blood-stained cloths and the lingering warmth of his presence. Sarah barred the door and sank into the chair he'd vacated, still warm from his body. Her wrist tingled where he'd touched her. Her hands remembered the geography of his skin. Outside, she could hear him dealing with the wolf carcasses, efficient even while wounded, protecting her still, though she'd given him no right to do so. No acknowledged right. Anyway, but her body had made its own acknowledgments. The way she'd reached for him without thought, tended him without hesitation, led him into her sanctuary as if he belonged there. Her mind might still resist, but her deeper self had already chosen. Sarah pressed her hands to her face, inhaling the scent of him that clung to her skin, wild and male and undeniably alive. Through the window, she watched him work in the moonlight, his movements sure despite the bandages. He'd killed for her, bled for her, and she'd opened her door. Winter had truly begun, and with it, the walls she'd built around her heart showed their first crucial crack. When she finally slept, she dreamed not of wolves, but of warm hands and dark eyes, of a presence that filled empty spaces she'd forgotten existed. She woke with his name on her lips, and the certainty that something fundamental had shifted in the night. The dance of resistance was ending. What came next? Sarah wasn't ready to name, but as she watched the sunrise paint the blood-stained snow pink, she knew there was no going back to the woman who'd barred her door against the world. Ayan had been right about that, too. She would open her door to him. She already had. The blizzard struck 3 days after the wolf attack, trapping Sarah inside as snow piled against her door. She'd weathered storms before, but this was different. The wind howled like a living thing, and ice crystals formed on the inside of her windows despite the roaring fire. By the second night, her woodpile inside was nearly gone. The rest sat under the lean-to. Might as well be on the moon for all she could reach it. Sarah wrapped herself in every blanket she owned, but cold seeped through the walls like water through sand. She was contemplating burning furniture when the knock came. 3 measured raps that cut through the wind screaming. Sarah's heart leaped. She struggled to lift the bar with numb fingers, fighting against the snow pressed against the door. Ayan pushed inside, bringing a swirl of snow and cold. Ice crusted his hair, his eyelashes, but he moved as if the killing weather was merely an inconvenience. In his arms, he carried an enormous load of firewood. "How did you—" Sarah's teeth chattered too hard to finish. He didn't answer, just moved to the fireplace and began building up the dying flames. Soon, blessed heat filled the cabin. Only then did he turn to look at her, taking in her blue-tinged lips and violent shivering. "You are nearly frozen," he said, his voice sharp with something that might have been anger or fear. "I'm fine." But he was already moving, pulling her toward the fire. His hands, impossibly warm despite the storm, rubbed her arms, her back, forcing circulation into her numb limbs. Sarah wanted to protest, but her body betrayed her. leaning into his warmth like a flower toward sun. "Foolish woman," he muttered, switching to his own language for words that sounded like curses. "Too proud to call for help." "Call how?" Sarah managed through chattering teeth. "Smoke signals." His hands stilled on her shoulders. "You make jokes while nearly dead from cold. Not dead, just cold. Your lips are blue. Your body shakes like leaves. Another hour." He cut himself off, jaw clenching. The concern in his voice, the barely controlled fear, undid something in Sarah. "You came," she whispered. "Through the storm. I will always come." The simple certainty of it made her eyes burn with tears she blamed on the warming air. He built the fire higher, then surprised her by moving to her kitchen area. Soon the smell of brewing tea filled the cabin, her tea, but with additions from the pouch at his belt. The liquid he handed her was dark, fragrant with herbs she couldn't name. "Drink," he commanded. "All of it." The tea burned going down, spreading heat from her chest outward. Within minutes, the violent shivering eased. Sarah clutched the cup, watching him over the rim as he shed his snow-crusted outer layer, hanging it carefully by the fire. "You were watching through the storm," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Why didn't you come sooner?" His dark eyes found hers. "You had not asked. I have to ask for help now. You have to choose it." He settled on the floor near her chair, his back against the hearthstones. Even sitting, he was nearly at eye level with her. "I will not force my presence, but I will not let you die from pride either." Sarah set down her cup, studying him in the firelight. The bandage from the wolf attack showed white against his copper skin. He'd risked himself again, fighting through a killing storm because somehow he'd known she needed him. "Stay," she heard herself say, his whole body stilled. "Sarah, the storm won't break tonight, maybe not tomorrow." She gestured at the frosted windows. "You can't keep traveling back and forth. Stay." "If I stay," he said slowly, "I may not leave." The weight of his words settled between them like another presence. Sarah understood. This was more than shelter from a storm. This was the moment of choosing. The door that, once opened fully, might never close. "I know," she whispered. He rose in one fluid motion, towering over her chair. "Be certain, once we begin this path, I am tired of being cold." Sarah interrupted, standing to face him. "Tired of being alone. Tired of pretending I don't listen for your footsteps. Don't look for you in the shadows." His hand rose to cup her cheek, thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "You shake still. From cold or fear?" "Neither." And it was true. The trembling came from something else entirely. Anticipation. Need. The terrifying relief of finally surrendering to what her body had known for weeks. He lowered his head slowly, giving her time to pull away. Sarah rose on her toes instead, meeting him halfway. The first touch of his lips was gentle, almost reverent, a question asked and answered in the same breath. Then her hands fisted in his hair, and gentleness burned away like morning mist. He kissed like he fought, with total focus. Overwhelming strength held in careful check. Sarah had been kissed before, but Thomas's dutiful pecks were candle flames next to this wildfire. Ion's mouth claimed hers with a hunger that matched her own, his hands spanning her waist, lifting her against him as if she weighed nothing. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Sarah felt transformed. The widow's weeds might still clothe her body, but the woman beneath had awakened with a vengeance. "Your bed," Ion said roughly, "or I take you here by the fire like an animal." The crude honesty of it sent heat pooling low in her belly. Sarah took his hand, leading him to the bed she'd shared with Thomas, where she'd held his fever-wasted body and whispered lies about tomorrow. But those memories felt distant now, faded as old photographs against the vivid presence of the man beside her. What followed was nothing like her marriage bed experiences, where Thomas had been apologetic, quick, almost ashamed of the act. Ion was unashamed in his desire. He undressed her slowly, his hands and mouth worshipping each revealed inch of skin until Sarah writhed beneath him. dignity forgotten in the face of need. "So pale," he murmured, tracing patterns on her skin. "Like snow, but warm underneath, fire waiting." When he finally joined with her, Sarah cried out, not in pain, but in recognition. This was what her body had been missing, what the empty nights had been building toward. Ion moved over her, within her, with the same focused intensity he brought to everything else. And Sarah, who had lain passive beneath Thomas's fumbling, found herself meeting him thrust for thrust, her nails raking his back, her voice calling his name into the storm-wild night. Afterwards, they lay tangled together, Sarah's head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow. The storm still raged outside, but inside, she felt a different kind of warmth, completion, connection, the rightness of two bodies fitted together like puzzle pieces. "Your promise," she said quietly. "About winter, about a child." His hand splayed possessively over her flat stomach. "It begins now. Tonight, I feel it. You can't know that. I know." He tilted her chin up to look at him. "As I knew you would open your door. As I knew you were mine from the first night I saw you watching the darkness, calling without knowing you called." Sarah should have argued, but her body hummed with new knowledge, with possibilities taking root. "And if you're right, if there's a child, then we go west before you show. Find a place where no one asks questions about a tall woman with green eyes and her Apache husband." "Husband," Sarah repeated, tasting the word. "You are my woman now." His arms tightened around her. "I am your man. The white man's papers mean nothing, but if you need them, we will find a priest who asks no questions." The practical part of her mind whispered about complications, about the life she'd be leaving behind. But that life was already gone, had been dying since the day Thomas drew his last breath. This wild, impossible thing, this was life flooding back. "Yes," she said simply. He kissed her again, and the storm outside seemed to quiet, as if nature itself recognized the pact made in this small cabin. When he rose to tend the fire, Sarah watched the play of light on his skin, the graceful power of his movements, and felt not the slightest urge to cover herself or look away. She was no longer the widow Mackenzie, that proper, grieving ghost. She was Sarah, woman of Ion, carrying his promise beneath her heart. And when spring came, when her belly rounded with new life, she would ride west beside him toward a future she never could have imagined in her careful, civilized world. But for now, there was just this: the storm, the fire, and the man returning to her bed with eyes that promised the night was far from over. Sarah opened her arms to him, opened herself to the wild sweetness of being thoroughly, completely alive. "Stay," she said again, and this time, they both knew she meant forever. By February, Sarah's body had begun its transformation. The morning sickness came first, sending her stumbling from bed to retch into the wash basin while Ion held her hair back, his large hands gentle against her neck. She'd hidden it from him for a week before he'd simply appeared one dawn, knowing without being told. "The child makes itself known," he'd said, satisfaction rich in his voice as he brewed her one of his herbal teas. Strong already, a fighter. Now, standing before the small mirror Thomas had hung for her, Sarah traced the subtle changes. Her breasts were tender, fuller. Her waist, though still slim, had lost its sharp definition. And there, just below her navel, the slightest roundness that could be imagination but wasn't. "You study yourself like a map," Ion said from the doorway. He moved behind her, his hands coming to rest on her belly. "What do you search for?" "Proof," Sarah admitted. "That this is real, that I'm not dreaming. The changes in your body are real. The child growing is real." He pressed a kiss to her neck. "Your fear is real too." She turned in his arms. "How do you always know?" "I know you." His thumb traced her cheekbone. "You think of the town, of their judgment when they see you carry an Apache child." It was true. In the weeks since the blizzard, since she'd chosen him completely, the outside world had felt distant, unimportant, but it wouldn't stay that way. Soon, her condition would show. The good women of Clearwater would see her shame, as they'd call it, would whisper about the widow who'd taken up with a savage before her husband's grave had settled. "We need to leave soon," she said quietly. "Yes, but first, you must learn." Ayan stepped back, studying her critically. "You know how to be a white man's wife. Now you must learn to be an Apache woman." "I don't understand." He gestured at her soft hands, her pale skin. "Where we go, there will be no towns nearby, no stores. You must be strong in different ways. I will teach you." So began Sarah's education. Each day, Ayan taught her something new: how to tan hide properly, making it soft and supple, how to find edible plants even in winter, reading the landscape like a book, how to move quietly through the snow, place her feet where they left little trace. "Your people make too much noise," he explained, demonstrating a silent stride, always announcing themselves to the world. "My people learn to be part of the land, not its conqueror." Sarah tried to imitate his fluid movement, feeling clumsy as a newborn colt. "I'll never be able to do that." "Not with those boots." He knelt, unlacing her sturdy shoes. "Feel the earth. Know where you step." The ground was cold through her stockings, but Sarah found he was right. Without the heavy boots, she could feel roots, rocks, the texture of the soil. Her steps grew more careful, more deliberate. "Better," Ayan approved. "The child you carry will walk both paths, white and Apache. You must know enough to teach them." The child. Every lesson came back to that growing reality. Sarah's hand went unconsciously to her belly, a gesture that was becoming habit. "Tell me about your childhood," she said as they worked side by side, preparing herbs for drying. "What was it like?" Ayan's hand stilled. "Different from what whites imagine. We were not the savages of your stories. My mother was a healer, respected for her knowledge. My father was a hunter, a warrior when needed, but mostly a man who laughed often and told stories by the fire." "What happened to them?" "Soldiers came." His voice went flat. "Said we must move to the reservation. My father refused. He died defending our camp. My mother..." He paused, selecting words carefully. "She survived long enough to see me grown, then let her spirit follow his." Sarah reached for his hand. "I'm sorry." It was long ago. But his fingers tightened on hers. "Our child will know their grandparents only through stories. But they will know. Tell me more," Sarah urged. "Help me understand." So he did. As winter days passed in preparation, he told her of ceremonies and seasons, of respect for the land and all living things. He taught her words in his language, simple things at first: water, fire, child, love. "Your tongue fights the sounds," he said, amused, as she struggled with pronunciation. "Everything about me fights," Sarah admitted. "I was raised to be one thing, and now you become something new." He pulled her close, hand splaying over her growing belly. "As I became new when I chose to walk alone, as we become new together." The changes weren't just physical or practical. Sarah found her whole way of thinking shifting. The rigid schedules of farm life gave way to a more natural rhythm. She woke with the sun, slept when darkness fell. She learned to read weather in the flight of birds, the behavior of her chickens, the way Ayan's old wound ached before storms, but the outside world wouldn't stay away forever. One morning, Sarah woke to find Ayan loading his rifle, his face grim. "Riders coming," he said. "From town." Sarah's stomach clenched with more than morning sickness. She dressed quickly, trying to hide the new fullness of her body under her loosest dress. Through the window, she could see them, 3 men on horseback, picking their way across the snow-covered prairie. "I recognize them," she said. "Sheriff Watson and 2 deputies. They come about me." Ayan's voice was calm, but she saw the tension in his shoulders. "Someone has seen too much, talked too much. I won't let them. You will say nothing of us." He gripped her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Whatever they ask, you know nothing. I am a ghost, a rumor. But, promise me, Sarah, the child, I promise." The words tasted like ash. Ayan kissed her hard, then slipped out the back as the riders approached. Sarah watched him disappear into the cottonwoods, moving like smoke despite his size. Then she smoothed her hair, pinched her cheeks for color, and went to meet the law. Sheriff Watson touched his hat as she opened the door. "Mrs. Mackenzie, sorry to trouble you." "Sheriff." Sarah kept her voice steady. "What brings you out in this weather?" "Reports of an Indian in these parts. A big one. Several folks claim to have seen him near the homesteads." Watson's eyes were kind but sharp. "You haven't had any trouble?" "No trouble." True enough. Ayan had never been trouble. "You'd tell us if you'd seen anything?" This from Deputy Collins, younger and eager to prove himself. "Any sign at all?" Sarah met his gaze calmly. "Of course, but I've seen nothing unusual." Watson studied her, and Sarah felt he saw more than she wanted. Her healthier color, perhaps the new softness to her face, the way her hand wanted to protect her middle. "You're looking well," he said finally. "Better than last time I saw you. I've had good hunting this winter, plenty of meat." Also true, if incomplete. Watson glanced around, his lawman's eyes cataloging details. "Well, you be careful, Mrs. Mackenzie. If this Indian is real and not just winter tales, he could be dangerous. A woman alone." "I have Thomas's rifle," Sarah said, "and I know how to use it." Still, Watson mounted his horse, but his look lingered. "Might be safer in town until spring. Mrs. Garrett has rooms." "This is my home," Sarah said firmly. "I won't be driven from it by rumors." The sheriff touched his hat again. "As you wish, but if you see anything at all, I'll send word." Sarah lied smoothly. She watched them ride away, staying at the window until they were dots on the horizon. Only then did Ayan return, melting out of the landscape like he'd never left. "They suspect," he said. "Maybe, but they can't prove anything." Sarah turned into his arms. "We need to leave. Soon." "Yes." His hand found her belly, feeling the changes there. "When the snow melts enough for travel. 3 weeks. Perhaps 4. 3 weeks." Sarah looked around the cabin that had been her prison and sanctuary. 3 weeks to say goodbye to everything she'd known. 3 weeks before her growing child made the truth impossible to hide. Will it be enough time? Ayan's smile was fierce with promise. "I have waited moons for you. We will make it enough." But that night, as Sarah lay wakeful beside him, she wondered. The town's eyes were turning their way. Her body grew rounder daily. And somewhere out there, a new life waited. One where she'd be neither widow nor proper white woman, but something altogether different. The child moved for the first time then, just a flutter like butterfly wings. Sarah gasped, and Ayan's hand immediately covered hers. "You feel it?" "Yes." Wonder filled her voice. "Oh, yes. Our son," he said with satisfaction. "Making himself known." "Or daughter," Sarah countered. "Son," Ayan insisted. "I have seen it." Sarah didn't argue. Whatever grew within her, son or daughter, was real now. Undeniable. The transformation was complete. She was no longer the woman who'd stood at her window months ago, watching the darkness. She was someone altogether new, carrying the future beneath her heart. The winter was ending, and with it, one life would close as another began. Sarah pressed back against Ayan's warmth and felt no fear, only anticipation. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The pains began at sunset on the shortest day of winter, when snow lay thick on the ground and ice crystals hung in the air like frozen stars. Sarah had been restless all day, pacing the cabin despite Ayan's concerned looks, unable to settle as pressure built low in her belly. "It's time," she gasped, gripping the table as another wave crashed through her. Ayan was beside her instantly, his face calm, but his eyes bright with an emotion she'd never seen before, something between fear and fierce joy. The child chooses a powerful day, when darkness turns toward light. He'd been preparing for weeks, gathering supplies with the same methodical care he brought to everything. Clean cloths waited by the fire, water heated in the largest pot. The herbs he'd collected were laid out precisely, each with its purpose. "I should have gone to town," Sarah panted between contractions. "Found a midwife." "No," Ayan's voice was firm. "No white woman would come for an Apache's child. And I have delivered babies before, in my village. Trust me." She did trust him, had no choice but to trust him as her body began its ancient work. The contractions came faster, stronger, and Sarah found herself making sounds she'd never made before, primal and raw. Ayan never left her side, his hands steady, his voice a constant anchor. "Walk," he commanded when she wanted to curl up in bed. "The child comes easier if you move." So Sarah walked, leaning heavily on his arm, pausing to breathe through each surge of pain. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent, blanketing the world in white. Between contractions, she watched it through the window, finding odd comfort in the gentle cascade. "Tell me again," she gasped. "About the place we're going." Ayan had described it many times, but she needed to hear it now, needed something to focus on beyond the crushing pressure. He spoke as he helped her walk, his deep voice painting pictures of red rock canyons and hidden valleys, of places where Apache and Mexican and white lived side by side, where a mixed child would be one of many. "There is a town," he said, supporting her as she swayed. "San Lucia. The priest there married a Mexican woman himself. He asks no questions, judges no unions. We will wed there if you wish it." "Yes," Sarah breathed, then cried out as the strongest contraction yet seized her. Time lost meaning after that. The world narrowed to sensation, pain, and pressure. Ayan's voice, the heat of the fire. Sarah had helped with births before, neighboring women in their travails, but being inside it was different. Her body had taken control, becoming something wild and powerful, beyond her mind's command. "I see the head," Ayan announced, his voice thick with emotion. "Dark hair, like mine. Push now. Sarah, bring our child into the world." Sarah bore down with everything she had, a scream tearing from her throat that might have been pain or triumph or both. The pressure peaked, became unbearable, then suddenly released as the baby slid free into Ayan's waiting hands. "A son," he said, wonder coloring his voice. "You have given me a son." The baby's cry split the air, strong and angry at being expelled from his warm world. Ayan cleaned him with practiced movements, tied off the cord, then placed him on Sarah's chest. The weight of him, solid, real, alive, made her sob with relief and overwhelming love. "He's perfect," she whispered, touching the tiny fingers, the shock of black hair, the little face that was somehow both Ayan's and hers. "Our son. He will be called Samuel," Ayan said, his hand covering both of theirs. "Samuel Ayan Mackenzie, a name from your world and mine." Sarah looked up at him, saw tears on his weathered cheeks. "Samuel means God has heard." "Heard what?" "My prayer for another chance." "Your call in the darkness." He kissed her forehead. "Then their sons. He has heard and answered with this gift." The afterbirth came easier, and Ayan tended her with the same gentle efficiency he'd shown throughout. Soon, Sarah was clean and comfortable in bed, Samuel nursing at her breast with instinctive hunger. The cabin was warm, peaceful, filled with the everyday miracle of new life. "The promise," Sarah said softly, remembering that first shocking declaration. "You said by winter I'd have your son growing inside me, and so you did." Ayan sat beside them on the bed, large enough to make it creak. "I saw it that first night, watching you, saw you round with my child, saw him at your breast. The spirits showed me what could be if I was brave enough to claim it. And if I was brave enough to accept it," Sarah added. She touched their son's cheek, marveling at the silk-soft skin. "I was so lost, Ayan, so ready to disappear into nothing. You brought me back to life." We brought each other back. He gathered them both in his arms, careful of the nursing baby. "From the ashes of our losses. We built this." Samuel finished feeding and lay content. his dark eyes trying to focus on their faces. Outside, the snow had stopped, and stars emerged sharp and brilliant in the clear air. It was, Sarah realized, Christmas Eve. She'd lost track of the days. But somehow it seemed right that their son should arrive now, a gift beyond any she could have imagined. "When do we leave?" she asked. "When you are strong enough. 6 weeks, perhaps 8. Ayan stroked the baby's hair. "The journey will be hard, but I have horses ready. Supplies cached along the way. My people, what remains of them, know we come. They will welcome you as my woman, him as my son. And after, when we reach San Lucia, we build a life. I know cattle, horses. You know farming, trade. Together we know survival." His arms tightened around them. "It will not be easy. There will be those who hate what we are, what he is. But there will be others who understand that the future is not pure white or pure Apache, but mixed like our son." Sarah leaned into his strength, exhausted but exhilarated. Everything had changed in the months since she'd stood at her window. A grieving widow with no future but slow fade. Now she was a mother, a woman claimed and claiming in return, ready to ride into an uncertain but vivid future. "No regrets?" Ayan asked quietly. Sarah looked down at Samuel, who had fallen asleep with the absolute trust of the newly born, his little fist curled around her finger. Holding tight even in dreams, she thought of Thomas, buried in the Clearwater Cemetery, and felt only gentle sadness for what had been. That life was over, had been over the moment she'd first sensed Ayan in the darkness. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Only gratitude." They stayed awake through the night, taking turns holding Samuel, whispering plans and promises. When dawn broke clear and cold on Christmas morning, it found them still entwined, a family forged from loss and loneliness, from wild promises and wilder faith. The widow Mackenzie was truly gone. In her place sat Sarah, mother of Samuel, woman of Ayan, ready to face whatever judgment the world might offer. She'd found something worth more than respectability or safety. She'd found herself, reflected in the dark eyes of an Apache giant who'd seen her truly and claimed her completely. Their story was just beginning. There would be hard rides ahead, dangerous passages, moments of doubt and fear. But for now, in the warm cabin with their newborn son between them, there was only this: love strong enough to bridge two worlds, hope bright enough to light the darkest winter, and the promise of spring coming to the prairie and to their hearts. Sarah kissed her son's head, then reached up to bring Ayan's lips to hers. Outside, the sun rose over a world made new by snow and by the miracle of one small life begun. Inside, a family that shouldn't exist by any reasonable measure drew their first breaths together. Proof that sometimes the most impossible promises are the ones most meant to be kept. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale, whether you're listening during your commute, relaxing at home, or perhaps somewhere unexpected. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Sarah and Ayan's journey in the comments below. Your feedback means the world to us. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.